All right, we're all recorded.
Okay. Shall I take it away, or do one of you guys want to say any remarks up front?
You can start. I would probably give it another minute or so and just wait
Okay.
for
Wait
people
till
to filter in.
7 straight up.
Yeah, and then we'll just edit out the beginning of the recording before
Okay.
we kick it off.
That works.
Dave, your presentation just went away. I don't know if
I
you.
just lost it. Yeah. I'm trying to brighten up the screen because all of a sudden it looked very dark. So give me 1 second. Is it back?
Not yet.
Okay, hang on. I'm not sure what happened. How's that?
It's back. Whoop.
It is back?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I see kind of your background image on the bottom a little bit.
Background image on the bottom?
Yeah. Yeah, you don't have full screen, David.
I actually am on full screen, so that's the reason I'm surprised.
Oh. Do you have more than one monitor, maybe?
I do, but I'm curious as to what else you guys see.
No, it's
There we
full
go.
screen.
It's good now.
Now it's back?
Yes.
Okay, who knows?
All right. Well, I guess we're ready.
Yeah, let's go. I guess I'm going. All right, so guys, welcome back. This is the second part of the Silent Killers of Enterprise IT projects. We're going to do this a little bit differently tonight than we had anticipated originally because of the fires. That we were made aware of the fact that a number of people, particularly in North Irvine, had to evacuate. Some are back, but not everybody is, so not everyone could attend this. So what we decided to do was to go ahead with the presentation, knowing that not everybody would be able to probably make it. We will get the recording out as fast as we can and shoot out emails so people can see it. And then what we're going to be doing is, opposed to having an extended Q&A, which I promised you all that I would do tonight, we're going to do that on November 5th. So a week from Thursday, we're going to have a much more extended session where anybody who wants to ask questions can. If you're sick of me by the end of tonight, well, then you don't have to come back. There's no need. But if you don't want to talk about this, it's just going to be an open forum, sort of a seminar format where anything you want to talk about is free game. I'm going to give a little homework for those that want to attend that, but we can get to that at the very end. So with that, I'm going to get going and we'll start moving ahead. We're having some technical issues tonight. Hopefully it won't be too major. And I'm having some throat issues because of the smoke. So I will apologize in advance if there is, if you guys have any difficulty hearing me, or if I'm choking, or if I sound a little bit nasally. It's just the sinuses with all the smoke. So with that, let's kind of get into it. What I want to do as we start, I just want to be sure to level set and recap the things that I went over part one, and then I'm going to talk about part two. So in part one, I really was focusing on four things. I was looking at, we talked about the frequency, costs, and causes of enterprise IT project failures. I discussed the fact that most of the pundits, in fact, all of the pundits, refer to this problem as something being caused by communication failure. But the reality is not communications. It's not what we're saying or how we're saying it. It's the fact that we're not talking to each other. So the issue is really silence. I went through a real life example of a case study of silence and actions, and then spent the bulk of the evening talking about these 7 previously unrecognized mental constraints, things that we didn't know we had, but things, behaviors of the way the human brain works that impact literally every aspect of our mind. So tonight in part 2, I had promised you a solution to the problem that I talked about last Thursday night, and that's what I'm going to get into. But before I do, once again, I would like to set the context, and I'd like to explain a couple things. So first of all, I want to recap those 7 previously unrecognized constraints and unpack those just a little bit better by way of review, as we talk about how this solution ties in with those 7. I want to speak very specifically as to how this solution ties in with PMBOK. So where this fits in our 49 processes. And I want to talk about something else that's just somewhat tangentially related, but it's come up in the past, and I think it's appropriate that we talk about it again. And this is the difference between understanding what the business is trying to do and delivering a tech-enabled solution. Now, once I've gone through the solution itself, I'm going to show you where, and I promised you last time that I would show you where you can get all the tools and information backing up everything I talked about in these 2 presentations. So at the very end, I will be doing that. And Phil, who I don't know who Phil's last name is, but Phil had asked a question last time asking whether or not there was a checklist or something like that. And in fact, there is. And that checklist is what I'm going to show you how you can get your hands on at the end of the evening. So we won't be doing a Q&A tonight, but we're going to be saving all that up for a week from Thursday as a dedicated session. So with that, let's get into the recap of those 7 mental constraints. So if we keep doing things the way that we're doing them now, remember that each member of your project team is going to wind up creating their own story about what the project is trying to do. Now, one of the key points that I want to stress with that, if you remember, stories are the way our brains organize information. So stories are not optional, they are mandatory. If you don't give your team a story that holds them all together, they're going to create their own. Now, the problem with that, with everybody creating their own version of it, is that everybody's story is going to be unique to them. It's going to have its own inaccuracies, and it's going to be complete, or incomplete, I should say, in different ways. And this is one of the biggest problems we often face. Everybody's got their own version of the truth, and no one's on the same page. Now, further complicating these stories, if the team members haven't seen or experienced something for themselves personally in the past, they're going to drop it. If they don't know what to do with it, they're going to leave it out of their story. They're going to be unduly and unconsciously influenced by all kinds of random factors from their own environment that they have no idea are impacting their story. They're also not going to have any idea that they're doing something that's unique or that anybody else holds a different view than they do. As they become more stressed, as the project gets under greater time deadlines, as people are yelling and screaming at them to get things done, it's going to be all the more difficult for them to be able to deliver what you need. They will not be able to think through, they will not be able to think through what it is that they need to be doing. And it's going to be a real challenge for them to be able to come up with that. The subject matter experts, the people in whom we place the greatest hope, the people in whom that we initially turn to trying to figure out everything it is about the process. Remember, those folks are going to be operating on a gist of reality, not the totality of reality. They're going to have their own version of the truth. Heretofore, we haven't recognized that. We haven't been aware of the fact that those people are looking at things slightly different than we have been, and that's going to be a problem. Now, something came up that I want to talk about because there were some questions about it last time, and I want to drill into this just a little bit more than I had originally planned on it. Remember, I talked about the automaticity and the idea that at some point, the more of an expert you become, the less information that you hang on to on your own. In other words, you start forgetting details. So you know something, but you don't know why or how you know it. Well, when that takes place, The processing of information that used to be in the conscious part of your brain is moved to the unconscious part of your brain. Now, this is a little funny. It's going to sound strange, so bear with me. I realize it sounds ridiculous, but there's kind of a point to this. One thing that I did not get into last time is that the human brain, you can think of it as having three shells or three layers. At the brain core or the brain stem is what neurologists and psychologists refer to it as a reptilian brain. It is the most basic form of our brainstem. It's where the lowest level processing is handled, the lowest levels of emotions are handled. There's a second shell around it that tends to deal with a little bit higher functioning that you're going to see in early stage mammals, things like that, rats, rodents, rabbits, dogs. But in humans, we've got this third shell, this third layer that is primarily responsible for all of the executive functioning. And by that, it means all of the analytical thinking and the logical thinking that human beings do. Now, when a human tackles something that they haven't done before, like learning to play piano or learning to understand how a process works in business, all of that function is happening at that third shell, at that third level, the outermost layer of your brain. Specifically, it's happening in a region called the frontal cortex. Now, when automaticity comes in, it's actually transferred from the frontal cortex to two other areas, the basal ganglia and the cerebellum. Now, those two areas are located down at the root, at the brainstem. So think of this as going from the very erudite, sophisticated human down to the reptilian brain. So this is the part that's funny, and I know that and it sounds ridiculous, but think of this as when you're talking to a subject matter expert, you're talking to the reptile. You've got a lizard that's in charge of that story. Now, that lizard is acting as a gatekeeper. That is the party that understands what's going on, and he's in control of that tale. Now, this is key. Somehow, we've got to get the story back from the lizard and get it into the conscious mind. And just so you know, just so you think, burn this into your minds. We're not talking about the Geico gecko here. We're not talking about the suave, sophisticated little lizard, cute little guy with a British accent. We're talking about a lizard. So we've got to be able to get that information away from them and get it back to something that we can work with. I'm going to sort of explain that in a moment. But there's an irony to the way that we've been doing things right now. And I think that irony is very critical for us to be able to consider. If we were trying to design a process that guaranteed our project would fail, we'd be really hard pressed to come up with something worse than what most businesses are doing right now. Now, there's another factor to this that we also need to consider. Historically, even today, we tend to assume the worst of people when they fail to communicate everything that they need to communicate regarding a business process. Now, the old acronym is SLIMEBALL, stands for stupid, lazy, incompetent, malicious, egotistical, and you can fill in the rest from there. But think of that acronym. We've thought the worst of people when they got this stuff wrong. Well, the reality is, and this is where the ethical component of this comes in, these people aren't being stupid, lazy, incompetent, malicious, or egotistical. They're simply being human. We need to adapt, I should say, the way that we have been doing things from an old paradigm to a new one. We've got to look at human behavior in a completely different light, and we've got to change our behavior accordingly. So let's move to the second step of this, the relationship of the solution I'm going to be describing in PMBOK. It is all about requirements. I'm sure most of you have figured this out by now. Where this sits is squarely on top of 5.2, collect requirements, which is not an inconsequential process. This one process is the foundation. It's the cornerstone of everything you're ever going to do in your project. If you don't get this right, your entire project's going to be messed up. The thing that's interesting about collect requirements, it not only directly impacts 25 of the 49 processes, it pretty much indirectly impacts everything else. So if we get the requirements wrong, it triggers a cascading failure that goes throughout the project. And to be able to circumvent that, to be able to stop it, I'm suggesting that we're going to have to implement a level of rigor in our requirements collections that we've not seen very often. I think there's a very easy way to do that, and that's what I'm going to be describing as we go on. So the third piece of this that I want you guys to think about is the relationship of the solution I'm going to be describing and software development life cycles. And a lot of people have asked whether or not there is one. And the long story short is there not. It's what I'm talking about is independent and indifferent to the type of development model that you're pursuing. So this solution is not about how you develop software or deliver software or configure software. It's about how you understand what the business is trying to do. Now, the reason that I'm bringing up this non-event is because several people in the past have brought up the issue whether or not I'm doing something that I'm not. And I just want to be sure that I dispel any questions right now. So a lot of folks have questions. They've wondered whether or not I'm looking backwards into the future, which is probably the best way to sum it up. They wonder whether or not I'm arguing for a return for waterfall for all. And I want to state very emphatically that is absolutely not what I'm doing. But when somebody brings that up, it makes me wonder whether or not they're missing some things. What I keep seeing over and over and over again is that it's something. It sometimes this almost feels like a cult of agile in businesses that I've worked with, and I wonder whether or not people really understand what agile's all about. And I think there are three sort of key points that warrant a little discussion. So the first is the fact that the Agile Manifesto came out of a Scotch and ski weekend in 2001 in Park City, Utah. It was created by 17 software engineers, not business analysts, not business people, not project managers, coders. Now, the reason they'd come up with that is because they were proposing this new approach because they were increasingly being asked by their clients to develop applications where no prior system existed. They were being asked to clap their hands together and produce a bouquet of flowers out of thin air. Well, when you've got absolutely no idea what that bouquet of flowers needs to look like, waterfall really doesn't make a whole lot of sense because you don't know what your destination is, so it's hard to plan the route. It's probably the best way to look at it. Agile was proposed as a model for addressing situations where that destination is not known. It's a way to invent the future in increments and find where you need to be through successive revelation. And in those situations, Agile is dynamite. It's absolutely terrific. I have used it many times successfully and swear by it. I'm a huge fan of Scrum. I'm a certified Scrum Master on top of being a PMP. So Agile's great where it's great, but it's not great everywhere. So IDC, remember from the very first slide or two in last week's presentation, I was talking about the fact that IDC estimates that only about 20% of our IT projects fall into the category where Agile is ideal, that about 80% would call for something that would invoke a hybrid model or a waterfall model. Those are situations where you're dealing with a process that is already extremely well known, deeply ingrained, and everybody's aware of it. So if you apply the very same logic that the 17 software engineers used when they came up with Agile in the first place, you would acknowledge that what works in one situation doesn't work in the other, right? So Agile is great where it's great, but it's not great everywhere. It's not the only tool in your tool bucket. It's not the right tool for every job. I was talking to some software engineers about 3-4 months ago, and one guy had a quote that I absolutely loved. He said, "Nobody in their right mind would use Agile to build a swimming pool." Well, that's right. You know what it is that you're trying to do. It's not a matter of discovery and invention. It's a matter of effectively customizing a solution to address the very specific need. The second thing about Agile that I think warrants some conversation is the fact that Agile has got two prerequisites that people very regularly ignore. Not everybody, but it happens a lot, and it's enough that it bothers me enormously. So Agile requires that the team be physically proximate and the business be continuously improved or continuously involved, not improved. I don't know where that came from. So when we're working in remote environments where our people are not shoulder to shoulder, that's one big knock against what Agile was originally envisioned to be. The second thing that I would suggest is that if you're NetSuite, or not NetSuite, if you're Netflix and you're building a new offering and you've got your product owner that is side by side with you all the day, doing market research and then passing that back to the engineering team or the Scrum team, and they're figuring out what they need to be building. The intimacy of that relationship and the guidance that goes along the way, it fits perfectly. But in most enterprise applications, you don't have the luxury of that type of commitment from the business. So very often it's the subject matter experts or the executives or the process owners' time is incredibly difficult to get. You're lucky if you're able to get their attention 5 minutes a day, let alone continually. So those two criteria often don't get met, and yet people tend to forget it. The third thing that I would bring up about Agile is that while it's perfectly reasonable to apply the standard that says we're going to get to the other requirements later, so we're going to address these other requirements as time goes on, that only works if you know what those other requirements are. So I'll give you a case in point. If my wife has got 15 things that she wants me to do over the course of the weekend, and I say, okay, I'll get to this tomorrow. Well, at the end of Sunday evening, if I haven't gotten to my list of 15, she's got a right to be upset with me if I haven't done everything that I said I was going to do, because she laid out for me what I needed to accomplish. But if she comes to me at 6 o'clock on a Sunday night and says, you didn't do any of the stuff I wanted you to do, and I said, you didn't tell me what you wanted me to do, it makes it really difficult for me to be able to address that stuff. So being in a situation where we haven't bothered to identify what it is that we need to build is kind of problematic. Gartner spoke to this a couple of years ago in one of their research papers, and they had a quote that I love, and I'm paraphrasing this, but they said, our projects don't need more governance. We don't need more or different governance models or development models. What we need is a greater focus on what it is exactly that we're trying to do, because those are the projects that actually succeed. So I think the final points that I need to make to this is the methods that are required to excavate, collect, and define a really accurate and complete description of what the business requirements are and what they need to do are completely separate and distinct from the methods that are required to develop and deliver software. And we need to be sure that that bifurcation exists, and we can't ignore it. We can't just blow it off. And I fear a lot of people have, and I think we've done it to a lot of our detriments. So the question now becomes, if our current methods for defining requirements are leaving us with holes in our understanding, then what is it that we need to do to be able to get us around that? So that is what takes us to our next slide. I'm going to suggest that we brazenly steal a page from people who already solved the same problem a long time ago. So bear with me with this. Now, I'm a child of Orange County. I grew up in the 60s when the Apollo program was in full swing. Half the dads on my street were Apollo engineers. Now, it's kind of interesting that the most outrageously complex, dangerous, expensive reach goal from a technology perspective, that the biggest, baddest tech project of all time was pulled off on time, on budget, and met every single requirement perfectly, and that was NASA's moonshot. Now, what a lot of people tend to forget is that when John Kennedy went in front of Congress in 1961 and said, we're going to go to the moon, we're going to land a man on the moon, and return him safely to the Earth, the United States had a grand total of 15 minutes of spaceflight experience. NASA had done the glorified equivalent of shooting a man out of a cannon. That was it. We had put Alan Shepard up about 115 miles in the air, brought him down about 260 miles downrange without ever getting close to orbit. And now Kennedy's saying that in 8.5 years, we're going to go to the moon and back. So by the end of the decade, we're going to land a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth. That's quite a reach. That's quite a reach. So how did we do it? Well, there's an interesting little story behind this. So I'm guessing most of you guys have at one point in time or the other seen this famous picture of Buzz Aldrin standing on the moon taken by Neil Armstrong, and you could see Armstrong's reflection in Aldrin's visor. Well, something that I don't know if you've ever wondered about before, but there is this, Aldrin is holding his arm up at this weird angle. He's got his left arm extended up at this odd crooked angle. Have you ever wondered what the guy was doing? Well, he was looking at his checklist. Interesting little aside on this. So he's looking at his checklist. So what people really don't know, unless you're kind of a space aficionado, is every single moonwalker had checklists stitched to their arm or on like a quarterback's playbook pad that they keep on their arm that we've all seen in the NFL, sometimes in college, right? So this is actually a picture of Neil Armstrong's glove. I cheated. It's not Buzz Aldrin's because the pictures that were available from the Smithsonian of Aldrin's glove were at a slightly different angle and it was tougher to see. But this is a really clear shot of it. So you can actually watch the footage of the moonwalk of Neil Armstrong on the surface, and he's going right down this list. Now, one thing, there's actually a couple things that I want to bring to your attention about this. The checklist mindset that NASA deployed got us from shooting a man out of a cannon to walking on the moon and returning a man safely to Earth in 8 years. Now, a lot of modern ERP projects have taken longer and had less success. That's a shocking statement, but that's not a lie. That's actually a true statement. So modern ERP projects have run longer with worse results. There's a couple other things to bear in mind. The checklist that was on Armstrong's and Aldrin's glove is the culmination of 100,000 other checklists generated by 500,000 other people over the course of the last 8 years prior to that moment. So that's one thing to think about. It was a checklist mindset, checklist upon checklist upon checklist, but they got it right and it worked. Stupid little solution, but it worked like a champ. The second thing to keep in mind, a lot of people don't know this. Buzz Aldrin holds a PhD from MIT. Now, he was the guy who figured out how to rendezvous in space. In fact, his nickname in the astronaut corps was Dr. Rendezvous. So he was widely regarded as being one of, if not the smartest guy in NASA, which is kind of saying something. And if there's anybody out there that you would have expected that would have been able to remember what he needed to do, it's a guy like Buzz Aldrin, right? But he didn't. So my point, even he needed a checklist so he didn't forget something mundane but important. Now, the point that I really want to stress with this is that really intelligent people understand what their limitations are, and they figure out ways around them. They work around them. Fools or idiots claim that they don't have any limitations and they stampede full speed ahead right over a cliff. Now, the third thing is in the 1960s, NASA didn't have anywhere near the clinical research on the human brain that we've got today. But what they did have is 30 plus years of aviation experience that taught them that they did need and why they needed to embrace this checklist discipline. Atul Gawande, in a book called The Checklist Manifesto, which is another one that I would sort of strongly suggest that you guys get your hand on. He tells the story about how checklists entered aviation in the first place. And it happened in the 30s when Boeing rolled out the B-17, the flying fortress that helped win World War II for the Allies in Europe. So the B-17 was far more sophisticated than anything that had been flown before. So what was happening was when the test flight crews first took it off, unfortunately, a lot of these guys forgot to do certain things and they died. They crashed the planes. So as Boeing went through the postmortems of the post-crash inspections to see what was happening, they realized that critical little details had been overlooked, like the flaps hadn't been set, the brakes hadn't been released, the turbochargers hadn't been turned on. So Boeing's engineers put together these simple little checklist. The pilots followed the checklist to be sure they'd done all the important stuff, and lo and behold, the problem was solved. Now, what's interesting is every commercial airline pilot follows a checklist to this day. They still go down exactly that same routine. If we don't do that, we're going to get ourselves in trouble. And unfortunately, we've been getting ourselves in trouble quite a lot. So let's start to head into what the solution looks like. Now, I'm going to spend a little time unpacking this because it's a fairly important slide. You guys can read this on your own, so I would encourage you to take a look at what's on here as I'm talking about it. The checklist solution I'm proposing is based on a couple of premises. First, as I talked about last week, 3/4 of our enterprise IT projects are failing because the subject matter experts, the business, the process owners, the execs are never fully communicating everything that they know and everything that we need to understand about what the business is trying to do. Now, I talked about this 5 slides back. These people are not withholding anything on purpose. They don't know, they're not aware of the fact that they're holding out on us. They're unconsciously overlooking very critical details because that autopilot, that lizard, the one they don't even know exists, has created a story about a process that's not only inaccurate, but it's incomplete. And the autopilot doesn't care. Because as far as that autopilot is concerned, details are irrelevant. Remember, we talked about all that last week. So in this situation, in the place where we usually meet, where we usually first encounter the subject matter experts, the process owners, and often tragically, the place where they stay, their autopilot's in total control. Okay? It's sitting fat, dumb, and happy, and it's completely blocking our ability to dig into the details we need. So somehow we've got to get past this unwitting gatekeeper. We need to stage a coup. We need to wrest control from that unconscious autopilot and hand it back to the conscious mind where the rational humans once again in control. Now, remember what I said 5 slides back. How are we going to do that? We've got to take this lizard on, but we can't do it directly. Because if we fight with them directly, all they're going to do is dig in their heels. The way we do that is we meet them where they are, but we start introducing new facts. We start introducing new details, new ideas, new questions to reset the conversation back to something that's completely new. What we're doing is we're taking it back to a place where automaticity has not had any chance to take hold. Okay? Remember from last time that automaticity is a place where the automatic processing capabilities kicked in, where our brain is hardwired circuits to make us more effective. Now, as we reintroduce new pieces of information, as we reintroduce a new framework to the subject matter expert, we take them to a level that's something that they already kind of know, but they've never thought about it this way before. So said differently, we're presenting it to them. We're presenting something to them that they're already vaguely aware of, but we're doing it in a way that they haven't really seen before. And when we do that, we take control back from the lizard to the human. We move it out of the unconscious and we move it to the conscious. Now, it's going to take you a few minutes to do this, but as you start introducing the facts and the ideas that I'm going to show you in the next few slides, you're going to be able to warm them up and you're going to see them engage and they're going to be able to understand what's going on. So what I'm really suggesting at the essence of this is that we're systematically destroying the old story. We're blowing it up because that old story is very rigid, it's very incomplete, and we're replacing it with a format that's a whole new story that actually covers everything we need. So we're going to build a new story about how the process works with them. Now, to do that, we need to do 2 things. We need to guide creation of that story. We need to walk them through that process, and we need to be sure that the story is covering everything that it needs to cover. We also need to make it extremely easy to use. It's got to be very clear cut. And that's what takes us to the second premise that I'm about to talk to you. So what most business people sort of intuitively know is that, but yet very few of them have ever really thought about, is that business execution is not the way we tend to think of it. Business execution is not a one-off linear exercise. Business execution is always a cycle. That cycle has got 4 distinct stages, 12 distinct steps, and it comes in 2 halves. Now, people don't think about it, but the first part of the cycle is where you actually execute. It's where you do the work. The 2 parts of the first half, the first stage, is where you do the work. Somebody actually moves a ball from point A to point B. Something gets done, a box gets made, an injection mold gets blown. The second stage is where somebody manages the work. So work is being performed and the work is being managed. In the second half of the cycle is where we actually start to track performance. Now, The first part of that tracking performance is where we assess the data, where we gather the data of what it is that we've done. So as we've been executing, as we've been managing, we're collecting data points in terms of how well it's gone. That's the assessment collection. In the fourth stage, we actually start to refine what it is that we're doing. And there's a very distinct way where we refine that information. Now, I want to explain, I will explain all of that in much more detail in a moment. But the thing that I want to get across to you guys is that these two halves, these 4 stages, these 12 steps, are not occasionally present in a business process. They are always present in a business process. And they always occur in exactly this order, which makes this framework incredibly handy, not only for mapping the story, but for creating a checklist to get the story told. So what we're going to do in the next 4 slides is I'm going to walk you through how that framework works and what the structure of the checklist is. But there's a couple things that I want to get into and I want to talk about before I do that. People, particularly non-technical people, a lot of business people that you're going to encounter, can get terribly overwhelmed and very confused by IT projects. Now, the IT industry is more in love with buzzwords than any other industry on the planet, and we throw out all kinds of new terms and terminology on a regular basis. We just make this stuff up for the heck of it. And a lot of it's marketing, but a lot of it's hype. It sounds new, it sounds sexy. Engineers fall all over this stuff, but everybody else is confused beyond belief with it. Or not everybody, but a lot of people get confused beyond belief. So we've got to create something that makes sense for those people. We've got to make it very easy to understand. We need to set the models and the stories up so that they're very easy to navigate. We need to help them navigate what the project looks like, and we need to create something that keeps everybody in sync so that everybody's on the same page as we go through this. So establishing the shared context is the foundation for our entire projects. Remember, I talked last time a lot about the fact if the boss can't say it, if the boss can't explain it, the project team can't do it. Well, the boss hasn't been able to say it because the boss has been controlled by his autopilot. We need to help the boss get that story out. And that's a whole new dimension to our jobs that we really haven't thought about too much in the past. So, having said that, let's start through these 4 stages. So stage 1 is where we do something. Now, I alluded to this earlier. Business is fundamentally very simple. It's about the process of moving a ball from point A to point B as fast and efficiently as you possibly can to hopefully generate some profit. That's it. Now, you can string together multiple sub-processes to create a more elaborate process, but the point of what you're after is you're trying to accomplish something. You're trying to do something. So in this first stage, we need to capture the storyline of that process. We need to map, we need to identify the horizontal dimension. Now, to do that, it takes 3 steps. There's 3 pieces to this. First of all, we need to talk about what we're trying to do. In the second step, we need to break that down. So we need to look at what are each of the interim steps that are required to be able to pull off that objective. And in the third step, we need to define how it is that we're going to know that we've accomplished those objectives successfully. Now, I'm going to continue with that NASA illustration. I want to go get into this just a bit for you. So when John Kennedy went in front of Congress and said, we're going to send a man to the moon, we're going to land and return him safely to the Earth, he set the goal. Now, what he didn't say, but what everybody understood is the reason we're doing this, why, which is a critical answer to every one of these questions in this checklist, in this framework. We were doing that because we needed to demonstrate that the American model was superior to the Soviet model. So this is very much a Cold War race to prove whose system was better. It was a propaganda stunt in some ways, very expensive propaganda stunt, but that's what it was. So Kennedy set the stage. But remember, NASA had only shot a man out of a cannon at this point. So NASA needed to figure out what they needed to do to be able to pull that goal off. So the very first thing that NASA did is they broke down that objective, that end goal, to its interim parts. So we knew that we'd been able to put a guy into space and drop him out of it, but we needed to get a guy into orbit. Then we were going to need to keep him alive in orbit. We were going to have to re-enter. We were going to have to put multiple men in a spacecraft. We were going to have to keep them alive for 2 weeks in space because that's how long it would take to get to the moon and back. We were going to have to navigate in space. We were going to have to be able to rendezvous in space. We'd have to be able to find each other in outer space. We'd have to navigate. We'd have to be able to dock. We'd have to be able to undock. We'd have to walk in space. We'd have to figure out a way to leave the gravitational field of Earth and travel out to the moon and then be captured for the very first time ever by the gravitational field of another celestial body. We'd have to go into orbit around the moon. We'd have to figure out a way to drop out of orbit, land on that moon, and get back up into orbit again, and eventually leave lunar orbit and return to the Earth. So there were about 16 or 17 steps that we needed to be able to accomplish. Now, what most people don't realize, in many ways, the moonshot was the first Agile project, because if you think about it, they successively invented what they needed to do step by step. They knew what their interim steps were. They'd identified their interim requirements, and then they proceeded to go ahead and execute it. So the moonshot was not a waterfall approach. It wasn't a waterfall program, which is kind of an interesting idea to think about, much more along the lines of a hybrid. Now, the third thing that they needed to do is they had to define what success looked like. So it's one thing to drop a guy out of orbit and have him burn up on reentry, landing 5,000 miles away from where you needed to be with man and machine destroyed, and to land a guy pinpoint on exactly where you wanted him to come down with man and machine intact. Now, it's interesting and it's valuable to note that your customer always determines what your success criteria are, but we need to know what it means. We need to draw that line in the sand and document it. What does it mean to be successful at each one of these steps? Which takes us to our second stage in the cycle. So remember, all work that's done has to be managed. So in this stage, we're looking at really three things. Who's going to be doing the work? Where is that work going to be performed, and how is it going to be organized? Now, the simplest way to look at this is like an org chart or the routing of a report or the routing of information up through a system. So the boxes on the org chart, and again, I'm just using a very simplistic illustration, but the boxes on the org charts are really answered by questions 4 and 5. The lines in the org chart, which dictate what the relationships are between that, are answered by question 6. Now, it's interesting to note, if you remember the case study that I shared with you last Thursday night, where that project went south was in this stage, because not only had they never identified who and what the participants are, they hadn't locked down all of the different elements that could be in the system, they also hadn't mapped what the relationships are. And it only took a few hours to be able to save a project that had gone south for 7 months and was 6x over budget. Okay, so far so good. This is the first half of this is the very first half of our process. Now I'm going to get into the second half of the process. Stage 3, first part of the second half, is where we collect data as to what's going on. Now, there are multiple things that are very important about this that nobody ever discusses, so I want to kind of hammer these things home. Remember, I said that business is about moving a ball from point A to point B as fast and efficiently as you possibly can. Now, you can think of that as, let's just use the metaphor of we're moving fluid through a pipe. Okay, you're bottling Coca-Cola and you're moving the Coca-Cola syrup from one end of the line to the other. There are only 3 types of metrics that you can ever look to evaluate the performance of any process. 3 and only 3. Now, there are thousands, tens of thousands, perhaps, of derivations on these themes, but there are 3 core messages. Those 3 are volume, velocity, and efficiency. So said differently, how much, how fast, and how efficiently did you move the ball from point A to point B? Okay, that's it. You need to boil this down and make it something very simple. So that's A. B, what people constantly forget is that your reporting strategy in business is your management strategy. Your people, your team are going to focus on those things that the bosses tell them to focus on, and they're going to ignore those things that the bosses ignore. We continually fail to realize that zombie reports and independent reporting silos are actually extremely damaging because they both distract and confuse workers. They're not directing people towards those things that are most important. They're directing them all over the place. So you're sowing the seeds of confusion throughout your organization. The third thing that I'd ask you to keep in mind is, and this is something that I had thrown out in the Q&A session last Thursday night, there's only one reason to ever write a report, to ever do a BI project or an AI project, and that is to answer a business question. If you don't have a business question that you can formulate in plain English, don't bother to write the report. Now, the fourth thing is that in this stage of the checklist, you're trying to identify the measures and the metrics that are the most important to help you evaluate how effectively you're managing the business and how effectively you're moving the ball from point A to point B. Start with the basics and then build out from there. But the key point that I want to stress on this deal is that if you figure out what these metrics are, if you can get it straight in everybody's mind what the data elements are that feed those measures, the source data for these measures and metrics, you will go a very long way towards capturing everything that you need to get in the automation part of the cycle to be sure that you're doing this right. Which takes us to our fourth and final stage of the business, which is where you refine, or the fourth and final stage of this framework where we refine what you're doing. Now, another couple of key components of this. One of the things that people perpetually fail to realize is that time in your life, in your business, is your most precious commodity. You've only got so much time to go around. You can't possibly be everywhere at once as a manager, so you need to figure out where you need to intervene as quickly as possible to get the greatest bang for your buck. To do that means you need to effectively construct, at the end of every reporting period, you need to conduct what's known as organizational triage, just like in a healthcare setting. You need to figure out those players that need help the fastest, and those are the people that you need to go to. Because when you intervene, you need to, as I said, you need to be able to get the greatest bang for your buck. Now, the good news is, to be able to do that, you only need to ask 3 questions. These are 3 incredibly powerful and important questions, but you only need 3 for every one of those metrics that you identified in the third stage. And the questions are these: what's okay, what's not okay, who or what's involved, and what's the cost? Now, what I mean by that is this. So for each of those metrics, you need to figure out, you or somebody in the business, some executive needs to figure out what is adequate versus inadequate performance. What's okay, what's not. Now, that you could draw that dividing line based upon a best practice, a statistical process control index, a budgetary number, a stretch goal. It doesn't matter how you define it. You just need to know where you're going to draw that line. A lot of people don't do that. The second thing you need to figure out is, once you've drawn the line, you need to analyze the performance of all the participants in the process, all of the customers, all the products, all the plants, all the salespeople. And you need to figure out who fell into the okay bucket and who fell into the not okay bucket. Now, once you figure that out, then you need to stratify them or stack rank them. And that's where you ask the question, what's it cost? Cost can be either opportunity cost or it can be a physical expense. But what you're after is you're trying to prioritize where you need to intervene the fastest. Now, the chart that I've got at the bottom of this illustration that you can see going from okay in green to not okay in the red. Let's say that you've got 100 players or 100 participants that are in the not okay category, and you've got a grand total of a problem. So the cost of all of this is $100 million. Well, say the first 95 contribute only $1 million. But the last guy, the 100th participant who is way wrong, is somebody that has created a $50 million issue. Well, if you take care of 1/10 of his problem, you would have solved a greater number of issues, you would have had more of an impact in your organization than if you would have solved 100% of the first 95. So that's what I mean. You need to target your interventions. You can't be everywhere at once. So you need to figure out where you need to be so you can get the greatest bang for your buck. Now, having said that, we need to be able, if my mouse will work for me, we need to be able to understand how this all comes together. So I want to talk about how this checklist is designed to address those specific mental constraints. So first of all, this framework of do, manage, assess, and refine, which is always appears in this order. It's always in the stages. They are all these stages, these steps are always there in every business process you're ever going to come across. That framework acts like a compass or a drum in a band. It's the drummer that keeps everybody in sync. It creates the shared 360-degree definition of the business cycle. And it prevents the problems that we experienced in the very first constraint, which is the autopilot. It overrules the autopilot, right? It creates a framework that has a higher priority that everybody can look at. So as opposed to looking at their own stories, it's creating a common story, which is the second constraint. This is a way of effectively painting by the numbers to outline a coherent story of what the business is trying to do. It's also an inventory of all the critical components in the business process. It ensures that we overcome the limitations of our 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of data. So if we've forgotten something, it acts as a crutch for us to be able to get that information out. If something is there, but we haven't encountered it and forgotten about it, it addresses the constraint of number 4, the idea of what you see is all there is. It doesn't let you drop things because it's reminding you of the fact that those items are out there and you've got to address them. It keeps us from being influenced or unduly influenced by unrelated outside forces, which are the priming effects and anchoring effects we talked about in constraint number 5. And it also guards against the brownout problems and the data loss issues that we talked about in constraint number 6, where power is cut, where we have rolling brownouts based upon emergency situations come up and we forget something that we were already working on. Now, the final thing that I think is very key about this checklist is a roadmap for conducting a structured, guided interview with your business people, with your subject matter experts, with your execs, with your process owner. It's a way to comprehensively build an interview. And in fact, I'm going to give you the interview in a little bit that you can use to walk your execs through a guided excavation of that process to get at all of the things that they know so well that they've internalized. And last but not least, and this is quite important actually, it may sound strange the way I'm going to say this checklist gives you permission to have conversations you never would have had otherwise. I'm going to say that again. This checklist gives you and everybody on your team permission to ask questions that you wouldn't have thought to ask otherwise. By virtue of the fact that it is on the checklist, it puts you in a situation where you need to address them. And because it's on the checklist, it not only lets you address them, it puts the onus on everyone to be sure that you do address them. So it frees you up to ask the uncomfortable questions that you've been kind of ducking in the past, or somebody may have been ducking in the past. Now, having explained how this all ties in to the constraints, I want to talk about why I think it's absolutely imperative that you adopt something like this. And the reason that I would say you should do this is really for a navigation exercise. If you don't confirm the details at each step of your process, if you don't circumvent, if you don't handle these 7 mental constraints, you're going to open the door for silence. You're going to open the doors for errors of omission in that process. Those errors of omission are going to beget misunderstandings that are going to beget more misunderstandings and cause more errors. So, as I said, anybody who's ever navigated should appreciate this. A very small navigational error at the outset can lead to a very significant error at the end. Now, one way or the other, and this is a really key point, one way or the other, at the end of every successful project, you are going to wind up answering every single question. You're going to wind up stopping at every single step in this framework. Now, one way or the other, you're going to get there. Now, what we found through research and what we talked about last time is there is a very significant financial penalty for waiting to the end to come back and remediate problems that you should have caught up front. And that penalty runs anywhere from 36 to 100 times what it would have cost you to run this, to do all of this stuff right up front. So yes, I'm not going to lie to you for a second and say that this won't take you a little bit longer to do. But you're going to save so much time on the backside, it won't even be funny. So I'm going to leave you with this one last thought. There's no guarantee on this, but the research regarding the use of checklists for these very types of issues is remarkably consistent. That what researchers have found is simply by putting a checklist in place, simply by being certain that you touch all the bases and you don't miss something dumb. Typical results are that yields an immediate reduction of about 40%, an average of about 40% in your errors. Now, think about what that means. If you can reduce the errors on your project by 40% right out of the blocks, just by walking through a checklist and being sure that everybody's on the same page, in my mind, that's a no-brainer. That's a really simple solution that you ought to be implementing. Now, I'm going to get into this in a minute, but I had some exposure to Jack Welch many years ago. And Jack Welch, the world famous CEO and chairman of GE, who oversaw a meteoric rise in the value of General Electric over the span of about 20 years, used to talk about the stuff. He'd say, it's the simple stuff that will kill you. Well, in private, he used a different word for stuff. It also started with S, but he cleaned it up a little bit for public consumption. It's the simple stuff that'll kill you. Well, all of this is simple stuff, but all of this will kill you if you get it wrong. And we've been doing a very effective job of killing ourselves in the past. And I think that we can probably do a little bit better going forwards. So, my friends, that takes us to a conclusion. There really are moral, ethical, economic, and self-preservation issues that are at stake here. And I am going to encourage you to look at all of them. First of all, we cannot continue to blame people for being people. We can't continue to ridicule folks, to punish them, to heap grief on them because they haven't done something right. They haven't communicated all of the information that they need to communicate. They are not being evil or malicious. They are simply being human. We cannot ignore these critical constraints, and we can't fight human nature, and we shouldn't even try. The second thing that I would comment on is the three trends that I talked about at the beginning of last Thursday. The continuing rise of the gig economy, remote work, and the rise of intangible assets. It's only going to make our job harder. This stuff isn't going to go away. It's just going to continue to grow as we go on. So we better get out in front of this stuff now. Now, silence as I've defined it, is currently causing U.S. companies to waste 4.5% of total revenues. Now that's waste that should have gone right to the bottom line as profit. Now there's a couple of interesting nuggets to bear in mind. The best available information that is out there right now from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and Commerce Department is forecasting that GDP in the United States in 2020 is going to be about $19 trillion. Now, last year, 2019, it was about $21.5 trillion. So there's a pretty significant reduction, about 2.5 trillion down, which is about 11.5% reduction in our economy. Now, we've never seen a reduction that big before. Even during the Great Depression, we never saw anything that bad. The best estimates that are out there right now are also that for the full year of 2020, we're going to see about a 20% decline in profits across the board. Now, what that means is for a company, any company out there, the average company, to recoup the loss that they are flushing down the toilet with this waste, they'd have to increase their sales by 15% at a time that the economy is collapsing by 11%. That's a tall order, because what that means is effectively you got to jump your sales, your revenue by 26% over baseline. So it's like swimming against a gigantic riptide. It's probably not going to happen. Now, if we don't do anything about this, if this is left unchecked, you absolutely know who's going to get blamed. First one that gets shot is the IT vendor. Second one that gets shot is the IT department. And the third one is us. We're the people that are going to be in trouble. Now, we have long sought, as have our IT colleagues, we've long sought to have a greater role in the business. We've tried to prove that we deserve a bigger seat at the table. Well, the framework and the checklist that I'm sharing with you is a way to earn that right. It's a way to set people up so that we can not only help our projects, but we can actually help our business counterparts and help those people not only better understand their business in the execution lifecycle, but also help them understand how they can leverage institutional knowledge, deliver greater value, and learn from lessons learned and hang on to their lessons learned. Now, as I wrap this thing up, I want to be really emphatic with this. Our goal is to help you guys shine. Our goal is to help you guys be better. And we're going to do that. But I used a couple of adages with my kids growing up that I would probably also use with you. We have been leaders. Now it's time for us to serve. So this is servant leadership in action, or at least we're trying to make the servant leadership in action. But the other thing that I would say to you is, I'll invest in you as long as you invest in yourself. And this is a mantra that I use with my kids almost every day growing up. I'm going to ask things of you guys before we get back together a week from Thursday. And before I share what that ask is, I want to explain something that has sort of driven my career. One of the things that I didn't mention is that I started off life thinking I want to be an academic. And I got into a pretty good doctoral program. It was at USC. At the time, it was rated number 2 in the nation. And one of the luckiest breaks of my life is that I got a boss who became the first chief learning officer in the world for Jack Welch at GE. So this guy's name is Steve Kerr. It's not the basketball coach. Steve was the first chief learning officer in the world. And after Welch left GE, Steve went over to Goldman Sachs and worked for Hank Paulson at Goldman. So he used to have this story, this little metaphor that he told so often that I can still recite it in my sleep. He said, look, I don't play a lot of golf. And I think truth be told, he hardly ever played golf, but it was a good analogy. He said, but I know that if I'm about to putt, and if I look down and see that there's a stick between my ball and the cup, if I bend over and move the stick, I'm going to have a much greater probability of sinking that putt. Now, if you get 100 people working for you, all doing relatively the same type of job, one of them by definition is going to figure out how to move the stick before the other 99. Your job as a manager is to find that person and ask them what they did. And you're in some detail, you're going to break it down and be able to understand exactly what they did so you can communicate that to everybody else. So when you pass that along to the other 99, what's going to happen? The mean tide of performance is going to rise. The entire organization is going to get better. And when you've stabilized at that next level, you start looking around for the next stick. That's it. That's all General Electric did for 20 years under Jack Welch, and it was wildly, wildly successful. And it's really something that's driven me throughout the course of my career. And there's a lot of sticks in what I'm sharing with you guys tonight and what I'm about to share and what I'm going to encourage you to read and go through. So here's the deal. I'm going to encourage you to go to www.itsaboutwhat.com/solutions. You're going to see a green download checklist button. Now, I'm going to ask you to download this checklist. It's a white paper that's 2 parts, and it's all pulled together in one file for convenience for download. So the first part's a white paper that explains the things in more detail and some more references than what I've gone into today. But the second part of this is what we call a process mining roadmap. So from an accounting perspective, it's really an audit program for auditing a business process. Now, to be able to do this, to be able to download it, I've just got 3 requests. We use an open source license on this, and there's 3 critical components that you need to be aware of. So first of all, you can use this within any organization free of charge that you are either employed by or where you volunteer. So you can use it internally. You can modify it to the cows come home. We do have a request, and this is the honor code, that if you come up with a modification that you think is a good one, we ask you to share that with us so that we can curate those modifications and those enhancements, and we can make it available to everybody. So our whole mission is to share these lessons learned across our entire domain, across our entire profession. Now, the final thing is you may not commercialize this. You are forbidden from taking this and charging somebody else to use it. What we gave you for free, we expect you to pass along for free. It would completely defeat the entire purpose of this if people started charging for it. We don't think that's right. We're trying to, it would defeat the objectives and the intent of the community that we're trying to build. So with that, I hope that I haven't gone way too long. I have. I just looked at my time, so I apologize. I'm about 5 minutes over. But I will conclude at this point. If anybody has anything real fast, I will turn it back over to Bill or Elizabeth. And I look forward to talking to you guys on a week from Thursday.
Thank you, Dave. Man, I can't get my video to work, but yeah, this has given us all a lot to think about. There's so much information here and things that are all very relevant and true to our experience for sure. So I'm very much looking forward to the conversations that we'll have with everybody next Thursday. I do want to point out before we wrap up that I have put the PDU information for this session in the chat. So if you participated for the hour, then you are eligible and you can submit that information yourself. Otherwise, that concludes this session, and we look forward to seeing you next Thursday.
Bill, one question I just happened to see come across, and I haven't been looking at any of the chat windows. We won't be sharing the presentation, but the white paper will explain all of the stuff that I have talked about in the presentation. That's a much better vehicle for getting the information out. Okay?
Thank you for that, Dave.
No problem. And with that, guys, thank you very much. Everybody stay safe. Everybody go vote. Don't forget to do that. And yeah, go Dodgers, Annette. I like that one. And we'll talk to you guys in 7 or 8 days.
Thank you. Good night.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night.
That was a live training.
That was a live training.
Yes, thank you.
I told you, David. I told you.
Well, we've still got a lot of friends on this thing, so be careful what you told me.
No, that it's exceptional.
Well, it looks like we lost a lot of people this time, so I'm sorry. How many people were on it?
I do not know. There's still 24, so
Yeah, so some folks are still hanging around. Well, look, I'll let you guys go now, but Darren, thanks for everything. Bill, thanks for everything. I know you're still out there someplace, and we'll catch you guys soon.
Mm-hmm.
And Darren, you and I will talk in the morning.
sounds great.
So diggy at dawn, as they say. All right, take care, buddy. See ya.